Oh, well, it's great to have Todd back with us today. So welcome, Todd.
Hey, it's good to be here. Thanks for having me back, Mike.
Great. We're just going to look at a few questions today based around an acrostic that you did, URWISE, and talking about the intellectual honesty that you think is associated more with theism than with atheism. Do you want to unpack that for us?
Yeah, well, so as a teacher, I'm always concerned that whoever I'm talking to or presenting to can recall, what I've been talking about. And I've found that acrostics can sometimes really help memory rather than just brute recollection. It's like, oh gosh, what did that guy say? What did that teacher say? What did that book say? So an acrostic can help with the main, letters to help. And so I've developed, I talk with a lot of young people and youth groups. And, does God exist is a big question. They get hit with this all the time. And so I developed an acrostic. U, R, Ys, and each letter stands for something that it doesn't prove that God exists, but it's called abductive reasoning, which means it's making an inference to the best explanation, most reasonable explanation. We use this all the time, Mike, and for instance, detectives, when they come to a crime scene, they use abductive reasoning. They make inference to the best explanation as to what happened. If you walked out and your carpet was wet, you'd begin to do abductive reasoning and saying, okay, what's the most reasonable explanation for this happening? Oh, I see there's drips on the ceiling. Well, that's a pretty good indication that maybe I've got a leak in the roof, etc. So each one of these things will stand alone on their own, but also as a whole, they do give an inference to God, theism, being the best explanation for each one of these letters in the acronym.
Great. Well, let's go into it. Let's do the first two letters today. I wonder if you could start with the first one, the U, which I understand stands for universe. And when you look at the universe, why does that point you to a creator?
Yeah. Whenever I get a time to talk to somebody about why I believe in God, the U is kind of the biggie for me. As you might recall, I used to teach science, and one of the sciences I taught was astronomy, not astrology. Astronomy, the study of the heavens scientifically. So there's two things about the universe that point us towards a creator God. The first thing is that the universe exists, that there's something instead of nothing. When I go to youth groups, I use a demonstration with a marble, and I hold up a marble. I'd say, would it be reasonable for me to tell you that this marble just popped into existence from absolutely nothing, for no reason at all, just popped into existence? And of course, the answer is no, that's absurd. And I said, well, what if I told you that the marble popped into existence, not just now, but a month ago? No, it's still absurd. Well, about a year ago? No. How about 13.8 billion years ago? Would that make it logical just because supposedly it happened 13.5 billion years ago? And the answer is still no. We know from science and from everyday observations that things don't just pop into existence from no reason at all, from absolutely nothing. And yet, even if this marble were larger or larger or larger, it wouldn't change the story. It wouldn't make it more logical or reasonable. It would make it more plausible. And so we use our everyday reasoning, and we also use the first law of thermodynamics, which says energy are neither created or destroyed. Things don't just pop into existence. But without God, without a creative force, the universe would have had to do just that, pop into existence from absolutely no thing at all, for no reason at all, without any cause at all. And so that would go quite contrary to the laws of the universe that govern us. Now, often I get on the backside, well, then who created God? Well, the cosmological arguments, the Kalam cosmological, it says this, that anything that begins to exist had a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe had a cause. The best explanation is God, or some kind of a divine being is the best cause or explanation to that. You'll notice in that argument is anything that began to exist had a cause. God never began to exist. In other words, cause and effect don't have any meaning. They don't operate in the absence of time. God is outside of time. He needs no cause. Material had to arise from an immaterial cause. That makes sense. Time and all of its constraints arose from a timeless, eternal cause. God is called the uncaused causer of all things. The irony of it is Mike, that for, when we start talking about an eternal God that's always existed, we get people that get a bit agitated. But for 2,000 years, just about, people had no trouble believing that the universe was eternal. It just always existed. Therefore, we didn't need an explanation for it. We didn't have to worry about God. But we are postulating that God, the unmoved mover, the uncaused causer, caused the universe as an explanation. The second thing about the universe, the first is that it exists instead of nothing. The second thing about the universe is that it's very finely tuned. It's perfectly suited to have life. And many of the parameters, the forces and the constants and the values of the universe are exactly, they're so precise that they couldn't be any different and still have life. Some of them are so finely tuned that we couldn't have a universe at all. For example, the charge on an electron. Back to science, in the atom, there's the protons and neutrons in the nucleus and then whirling around the electrons. The charge of that electron, if it were even slightly less or slightly greater, we wouldn't have atoms. They wouldn't hold together. The very mass of the protons in the center of the atom, it couldn't be different by even the slightest degree, or we wouldn't have atoms again. Even the very mass of the universe itself, it's fine-tuned to 1 part in 10 to the 59th power. What that means is 1 with 59 zeros after it. The force of gravity is very finely tuned, the strong nuclear force, the electromagnetic force, on and on it goes. The expansion rate, the galaxy expanding, if slightly different, the galaxies were separating and expanding at a faster rate or a slower rate, we wouldn't have had galaxies formed and life formed. I give the analogy of this. Think of you go to a rock concert or some kind of a large church service, and there's a large mixing board, with all the gadgets and the buttons on there. Imagine there were some 1,500 dials on that mixing board. And each of the dials, instead of just having maybe 1 to 10 settings, each dial had 100 settings. Now imagine that every one of those 1,500 dials with 100 degrees of setting on each, every one had to be set exactly to the right setting. Otherwise, you'd get no sound at all. It wouldn't just be that the sound was off. It wouldn't be that it sounded too echoey or bassy. It would be no sound at all. That's the analogy I would draw between many of the constants and forces and laws that govern the universe and the universe's existence. And so the probability of this happening by chance is beyond the impossible. It's some of them, like the strength of gravity, is tuned to 1 part in a trillion in its tolerance there. So the universe is like a giant plot to make life possible. This is called the anthropic principle. You Google fine-tuned universes and you'll see atheists, cosmologists, and astrophysicists talking about some of these constants and stuff, and it's a bewilderment to them. They don't understand it. They can't explain it. Even Stephen Hawking, the late Stephen Hawking, wrote in his book A Brief History of Time about the anthropic principle. We live in the Goldilocks zone. Everything is just right. Christopher Hitchens said, without question, the fine-tuning argument is the most powerful argument on the other side. So I would suggest that the universe, that it exists and that it's finely tuned, is best explained by an eternally existing, infinitely wise, all-powerful creator God.
I know, I think about my tomatoes out there ripening with the sun just at the right distance to make it all happen. It's amazing. The second part of your acrostic is reason. Now, obviously, you've been reasoning through this and you've got an ability to think through these things and to come with some hitbacks, as it were. So tell us about why you think reason is another, or the capacity to reason points us towards a creator.
Yeah. Well, so as you pointed out, Mike, we can think, we can reason, we can analyze, we can draw conclusions, and we can trust that our thoughts and our reasonings are rational, they're meaningful. If our brains were only the result of random chance collisions of molecules in motion, which is what the materialist, the atheist position has to be, how could we trust our thoughts at all? How could we trust it, that our thoughts were rational, coherent, that we could trust them? I love the quote by C.S. Lewis. He says, if the solar system was brought about by accidental collision, then the appearance of life on this planet was also an accident. The whole evolution of man was an accident too. If so, then our present thoughts are mere accidents, the accidental byproduct of the movement of atoms. But if our thoughts are merely accidental byproducts, why should we believe them to be true? I see no reason for believing that one accident should be able to give a correct account of all other accidents. So Lewis was succinct and summarized well, as only Lewis can, the problem with rationality at all. In other words, the argument that, well, you know, that you would argue against God. Well, how would you even argue that cogently or rationally if you are just a product of random collisions, that you are pre-programmed biological machine like that? You know, they're trying to create artificial intelligence to fine-tune it to a degree. And if they get to a point of creating true artificial intelligence, it'll prove one thing, that it took an intelligent, sentient being to produce it. It would be operating after the producer, creator's own image. And I would argue that that's what we operate in. God is a rational, sentient being, and we are created in his own image. And beyond us just being, having a brain and be able to process data and think rationally, we have a consciousness. We're self-aware. We have a distinct I. And this is a really big problem for atheist materialists, because matter, from which everything supposedly evolved, starting with the Big Bang, it doesn't have consciousness or even a potential for consciousness. If you think about it, could you ever expect, say, a hydrogen atom to feel, to know itself, to contemplate its own existence? Well, no, you couldn't. Well, what if you added another hydrogen and an oxygen, and you got H2O? Would a water molecule think, feel, know itself? No. What about a rock? No. What about a 2-pound bag of spaghetti, which has roughly the same chemical composition of your brain, your carbon, hydrogen, oxygens? It can't think, reason, feel, have a consciousness. And so it's the old, Pinocchio and Geppetto thing. The old woodworker worked on Pinocchio and gave him more detail and carved and gave him clothing, painted him. And we know it's only a fairy tale that at some point that inanimate matter would pop out and say, I'm a real boy. But somehow, without God, that's what we feel would have to believe would happen with human beings and other things that have a consciousness to them. So if you start with just matter and chemicals and you rearrange it, you'll end up just with rearranged matter and chemicals, not consciousness. Consciousness would never arise from matter. So I would postulate that our ability to reason, and that we have a consciousness and a self-awareness, which is admittedly a large problem for naturalists, is best explained by man being created by a God with consciousness, who reasons, who created us in his image and likeness.
And it's nice to have someone to thank rather than a mindless random mutation.
Well, exactly right. Exactly right.
C.S. Lewis also said, if God is no bigger than our mind, is he really worth believing in? So we have the limits to our rationality as well. But it's so, and the next question is the limits. Science, what do you have appreciated about science and where science can go and take us and the blessing that it can be to us, but also understanding its limits in terms of some of the questions or the existential questions that, it may try to answer, but it's really outside of its realm.
Yeah. Well, if you listen to the last interview with Mike and I, you'd have heard that I was a science teacher back in California for about 10 years. I taught a little bit of biology, a little bit of physical science and oceanography, and I love science. I mean, science, it rocks. It's a great tool for discovering, for exploring, for making sense of the world around us, and it's a great practical use and benefit to mankind. Think of all the advances in medicine and technology and engineering, and so we're the recipients of great science that's gone on before us. And a lot of people don't know this, that science, the science pioneers of old were Christian, most of them, some of them just theists, believing in a God, but many of them were Christian, and their Christian worldview actually drove them to discover, drove them to try and explore and explain the universe around them. Newton said, all my discoveries have been an answer to prayer. And Kepler said, if the universe is orderly, if there's a God in the universe, it must be orderly. So let me begin to discover this order. And he, of course, discovered the laws of planetary motion and that they were ellipses and stuff like that. But science doesn't have all the answers. It can't have all the answers. The axioms that, any question worth asking can be answered by modern science, or truth can only be discovered through empirical investigation. Those are false axioms. I mean, science is incapable of telling us about some of the major realities of life around us, some of the superfluous ones. Poetry. What does science have to say about poetry and art and beauty and love and consciousness and morality or God? Nothing. Trying to learn about these things through science is like trying to tell a scientist to tell me the temperature of the room using this microscope. No matter how hard he would try, he would not be able to tell you the temperature using the microscope. It's the wrong tool to diagnose that. And trying to discover anything about love and art and beauty and poetry and morality through science it's impotent to do that, right? So they're not designed, they're not capable for that. Some of the biggest worldview questions that we have in life are science is mute on the issue. Where did we come from? What's the purpose and meaning of life, of my life? Is there such thing as morality, right and wrong? What happens after I die? These are major big questions that are asked by 4 or 5-year-olds because we're made in the image of a God with rationality. Science can tell us that the how, but not the why. Science could tell us, how water boils. The heat energy is turned into kinetic energy, and the water molecules move faster and faster, and finally escape, etc. But they can't tell us why the water boils. The water boils because I wanted a cup of tea. Yeah. Okay, that would be the why of it. And so science answers a lot of hows, but not the whys. It's ironic that two great scientists came to different conclusions. Sir Isaac Newton discovered the laws of gravitational attraction. Stephen Hawking says because we've got the laws of gravity, the universe exists. In other words, that takes care of it. But Isaac Newton, after discovering the laws of gravity, he went on to write the most famous book in the history of science called the Principia Mathematica. And in the cover of that, he expressed the hope that it would persuade the thinking man to believe in God. So it wasn't that, we've discovered the laws of gravity, therefore we don't need God. It was, look what God has done. Let us drive to discover and know more about God. God's got 2 books, the book of nature and the book of Revelation in the Bible. They don't contradict one another. When interpreted correctly, they go hand in hand.
That's fantastic, Todd. I really appreciate this time in the first part of the acrostic, and I'm looking forward to the next part next week. So again, thank you for giving us your time, and we look forward to catching up again next week. Thank you, Todd.
Mike. Well, it's been a pleasure. All right.
Okay. If anybody has any questions and they would like to know more, Todd comes from Thinking Matters, so you're welcome to look on their website and see information in regards to the questions we're asking today. Also, feel free to contact us at the church if there's anything that you would like to ask Todd as well. So God bless. Thank you. See you, Todd.
All right. Until next time.
Okay.
Bless you now.